Right after my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law snarled at me. Now your daughter belongs to me, and you can get the hell out of here. My daughter silently lowered her eyes. He thought I was just some harmless old fisherman he could easily push aside. I made one phone call. The next morning, my son-in-law was on his knees in front of me, begging for mercy. He had no idea who I really was, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. Christine Sanchez asked my daughter, loud enough for the whole table to hear, whether your father has figured out where he'll sit so he doesn't block the photographer's view. She smiled when she said it, that particular smile that belongs to women who've never had to apologize for anything in their lives, the kind that isn't really a smile at all. Megan laughed, a short, polished little laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Then she looked down at her menu. I watched all of this from across the rehearsal dinner table and said nothing. That's a habit I picked up a long time ago. Not the silence itself, but knowing when silence is the right tool. I'm Raymond Ford. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in Mooresville, North Carolina, long enough that the Catawba River feels more like family than geography. I retired 4 years ago from Ford and Whitfield LLP, where I spent 3 decades as a senior partner in corporate law. These days I grow heirloom tomatoes in my backyard and drive out to the river before sunrise to fly fish. Nobody at that dinner table knew any of that, and I had no particular reason to tell them. The Sanchez family had arrived at La Maison on Providence Road, like a minor weather event. Arturo Sanchez, David's father, 64 years old, built like a man who'd done physical labor before he could afford not to, walked in already talking. By the time the bread arrived, he'd explained to everyone within earshot that his new development project near Concord was valued at $14.2 million, and that the financing basically handled itself. Christine orbited him, agreeing with everything, straightening the silverware she didn't need to straighten. David, my son-in-law as of 3 days from that evening, sat at the center of the table and accepted attention like a man who considered it his due. He was 36, broad-shouldered, with a salesman's ease in conversation. He spoke to Megan's friends. He spoke to the event coordinator. He spoke to the sommelier. He did not speak to me directly once during the entire dinner. Not once. I noticed the way you notice a crack in a foundation, not because it ruins the room, but because you know what cracks mean. Megan was radiant that night. She'd always been the kind of person who walks into a room and recalibrates it somehow. Warmer, slightly more alive. She's 34, an architect by training, and she has her mother's ability to make every space she occupies feel intentional. She laughed easily and touched David's arm and was, by every visible measure, happy. I watched her the way I watched the Catawba in early morning, quietly, looking for the current beneath the surface. After dinner in the parking lot, I was unlocking my truck when I heard David's voice carrying from the side of the building. He was on his phone, standing near the hedgerow, facing away from me. The night was cold and still, the way November nights get in the Carolina Piedmont, and sound carried cleanly. After the wedding, the old man's out of the picture, he said. Don't worry about it. A pause, then a low laugh. Megan handles him. She always has. I stood with my key in the door. I thought about whether I'd misheard. I hadn't. I've spent 3 decades in rooms where people said things they thought no one important would hear. I know that voice. I've used that voice. I got in the truck. I drove home. I did not call Megan. I did not turn around. I simply filed it. The morning of the wedding, I put on the gray suit Megan had picked out with me in September. She'd held it up against my shoulders in the store and said, "Dad, you look like you mean business." And I'd told her that was generally the point of a suit. She'd laughed. It was a good morning. The Lakeside Grand was everything she'd asked for. A venue on the water, high ceilings, November light coming through tall windows. I had written the check for $43,800 6 weeks earlier, without discussion, because Megan had done the work of finding the place and organizing the vendors and managing the Sanchez family's opinions about the menu, and the least I could do was make sure the bill was handled. I didn't mention the amount. I don't lead with money. That has always seemed to me like a poor substitute for character. The ceremony was elegant. Megan walked with her chin up and her eyes clear, and when she reached David at the altar, she smiled the real smile, not the polished one. I sat in the front row and told myself this was enough. During the reception, Arturo stood to give a toast. He spoke for several minutes about family, about new beginnings, about his son's remarkable journey. Then, turning to the room with the timing of a man who'd rehearsed the moment, he said, and perhaps most importantly, the young couple can finally start separating themselves from old habits. He looked at me when he said it, just for a second, long enough. The table laughed. Several people who didn't know what they were laughing at laughed anyway because Arturo had delivered it like a punchline, and the room responded to his confidence. Megan's smile flickered. She recovered quickly. She was good at that. I raised my glass. I smiled. I said nothing. The reception ran through the evening. I danced with Megan once, a slow song, something from the band's standard rotation, and she put her head on my shoulder briefly, the way she used to when she was small and something had gone wrong at school. I didn't ask her about it. Some things require space to exist before they can be spoken. The guests were leaving in clusters by 10 o'clock. The band was packing up. I was near the coat check, waiting for a jacket I didn't need, but had claimed as a reason to stand somewhere specific, when David appeared at my shoulder. He was close, closer than the space between two people usually allows unless the approach is deliberate. Raymond. His voice was low, quiet, with a particular brand of control in it, the kind that's meant to sound calm but is actually the opposite. I think we should be clear about something. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. Megan is my wife now, he said. She belongs with me. Her life is with me. And honestly, he paused, making sure I was watching his face. You can take yourself out of the picture. It'll be easier for everyone. Megan was 3 feet to his left. She had heard. I could see it in the set of her shoulders. That particular stillness that isn't peace. That's practice. She looked at the floor. I looked at David for 5 seconds. I've counted seconds in courtrooms and conference rooms for 30 years, and 5 seconds is longer than most people can hold eye contact with someone who isn't flinching. Good night, David, I said. I got my jacket. I walked to my truck. I sat in the parking lot of the Lakeside Grand for 10 minutes with the engine off, watching the lights of the venue reflect on the water. Then I picked up my phone and called Paul Bennett. Paul picked up on the third ring, which is fast for midnight, and which told me he'd been awake. He used to do that when we worked together, stay up late going over case files, the kind of habit that either breaks you or becomes you. Paul had become it. He's been one of Charlotte's better corporate attorneys for the past decade, the kind of lawyer other lawyers refer to when the problem is complicated enough to matter. Ray, he said, just my name, the way people say it when they know something's coming. I have a question, I said. Are you still doing work with the North Carolina Contractor Licensing Board? A beat of silence. Yes. Do you know if there's a pending application from an entity called Arturo Sanchez, Development LLC? This silence was longer. I could hear him thinking, not hesitating, thinking. There's a difference. Ray, are you sure about this? I'm sure I want you to check, I said. I drove home. I went inside. I didn't pour a drink, because that's not a habit I cultivate. I sat at the kitchen table on Cedar Grove Lane and thought about the last 18 months. I should go back further than that. Megan had introduced me to David 19 months ago, at a Sunday dinner she'd made at her apartment in South End. She'd been nervous in the way you're nervous when something matters, checking the food twice, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling. David arrived with wine and a firm handshake and the specific kind of easy confidence that, in my experience, tends to sit at one of two addresses, genuine security or a very practiced performance of it. He asked me questions about retirement, about Mooresville, about the river. Good questions, the kind that show someone did their homework, or at least knows how to seem like they did. I answered them. I was pleasant. I've always been capable of being pleasant. The second time I met him at a cookout at Megan's place in August, he interrupted her 3 times in a single conversation. Each time was smooth enough that it might have looked like enthusiasm. The third time, she stopped mid-sentence and simply waited for him to finish, before continuing in a slightly quieter voice. I noticed. The third time I saw them together was Thanksgiving. David held court at the table, and Megan served. Not in a practical sense, we all served ourselves, but in that other sense, the more important one, where a person makes themselves smaller, so someone else has more room. I watched my daughter arrange her opinions to fit the edges of his, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. After dinner, when David had stepped outside to take a call, I asked her quietly how things were going. "Good," she said. "Really good." She smiled in that careful, considered way. I said, "You seem tired." She said, "I'm fine, Dad." I let it go. You can't take something from someone who isn't ready to put it down. The next morning, Paul called before 7. I was already awake, already on the porch with coffee, watching the light come up over the yard. "The application exists," he said. "Arturo Sanchez Development, LLC. Filed about a month ago. It's in the final stage of technical review." He paused. "There's a name on the technical committee you'd recognize." He told me the name. I recognized it. A former colleague from the early years at Ford and Whitfield, a man I'd worked alongside on a commercial zoning dispute in 2007 that had kept us both in the office until past midnight for 3 straight weeks. We weren't close now. We didn't need to be. "There's more," Paul said. He walked me through what he'd found on the corporate side. David's 3 properties, managed through something called Sanchez Property Group, LLC, were carrying debt tied to a credit line from Carolina Realty Fund. That name I recognized for a different reason. I'd been on the investment advisory board of Carolina Realty Fund for 6 years. I still was. Board members with a stake in a borrower held specific procedural rights under the fund's operating agreement, including the right to request a formal audit of any active borrower. I had technically just found out I had a son-in-law who was a borrower. "Paul," I said, "don't move anything yet." "Ray, I mean it. Nothing moves yet." I went inside. I put on my waders. I drove out to the Catawba and spent 2 hours on the water with a 6-weight rod and an elk hair caddis, working a stretch of riffles I know well enough to fish in the dark. Fly fishing requires patience of a particular kind. Not passive patience, but active patience, the kind where your attention is completely engaged and you're doing nothing dramatic. You're reading the water. You're waiting for the right moment. You're not forcing anything. By the time I drove home, I had the shape of something. Not a plan. Not yet. But the architecture of one, the way I used to see a legal strategy before I started drafting. The load-bearing structures first, then the details. David had said I was out of the picture. Arturo had implied at a table full of people that I was an old habit to be discarded. Christine had questioned whether I knew where to sit without causing inconvenience. None of them had asked who I was. They'd decided. That's a category of error I spent 3 decades watching people make. The assumption that what they see is the whole of what exists. In law, we called it failure of due diligence. In ordinary life, people call it a mistake. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I had 2 tools, and I needed to understand them precisely before I touched either one. The first was the audit right, a formal mechanism documented in the fund's operating agreement, clean and defensible. The second was procedural standing at the licensing board, indirect but real, through a colleague who owed me nothing but who functioned within a system I understood in detail. I wasn't going to call in favors. I don't operate that way. I was going to use what I was already legally entitled to use, hire the professionals I needed, and let the documents speak. Documents always speak. That's the thing people forget. The thing David hadn't known to consider when he stood 3 feet from his new bride and told her father to remove himself from their lives. Paper remembers everything. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window and looked at the backyard. The garden beds turned over for winter, the bare stakes where the tomatoes had been. Megan had helped me plant those in April. She'd gotten soil on her shoes and complained about it, and laughed while she complained. My phone buzzed. A text from Megan. "Just landed in Asheville. Room is beautiful. Thank you for everything today, Dad." I typed back, "Enjoy every minute. You deserve it." I set the phone down. Then I went to find Paul Bennett's number and started making a list. The thing about being underestimated is that it has a shelf life. At some point, it stops being an inconvenience, and starts being an asset. The week after the wedding, while Megan and David were in Asheville, I drove into Charlotte twice. Not to meet anyone. Not yet. I went because I needed to think in motion. I've always been better at it that way. And because I wanted to look at 3 specific addresses without having any particular reason to be looking at them. Sanchez Property Group, LLC, according to the public records Paul had pulled, operated 3 rental properties. The first was a mixed-use building on South Tryon, 2 retail units below and 4 apartments above. The second was a single-family rental in Plaza Midwood that had been converted into a duplex at some point in the past few years. The third was a commercial warehouse space in the Belmont neighborhood, currently leased to a logistics company. I drove past all 3, didn't stop, didn't photograph anything. I just looked, the way you look at a property when you're thinking about what it's worth and what it's costing, and those 2 numbers aren't the same. The South Tryon building had a management sign in the window with a phone number that wasn't registered to Sanchez Property Group. It was registered to a separate LLC I hadn't seen in Paul's initial search. That was interesting. Not alarming, not yet. Lots of property managers operate under separate entities, but interesting in the way that a loose thread is interesting when you're not sure what it's attached to. I wrote it down when I got back to the truck. I have a small notebook I keep in the glove compartment for exactly this kind of thing. Old habit. I used to fill them during depositions. Not the formal record, but my own notes. The things that didn't fit neatly into the official transcript. The asides. The hesitations. The moments when a witness adjusted their posture before answering a particular question. David, I was increasingly certain, was the kind of man who adjusted his posture a great deal. Megan called me from Asheville on the 3rd day of the honeymoon. She sounded cheerful enough. They'd hiked the Blue Ridge Parkway, dinner at a place in the River Arts District. Good wine. I listened and asked the right questions and didn't mention any of what I'd been doing. She didn't need to know yet. What she needed right then was for her father to ask about the hike and whether the weather had cooperated. It was beautiful, she said. Cold, but beautiful. The river's like that in November, I said. Cold tends to clarify things. A short pause. Dad, are you being philosophical at me? Just making conversation, she laughed. The real laugh, not the polished one. I held on to that. After she hung up, I sat for a while and thought about what I'd observed over the past 2 years. Not emotionally, but systematically, the way I used to prepare a case summary. David's behavior followed a pattern that was, once you saw it, almost tediously consistent. Public charm, private control. Warmth deployed strategically in front of audiences, pressure applied precisely when no one else was watching. He was, in the language of the field, a sophisticated operator, the kind who understood that the most effective manipulation leaves no visible marks. I'd seen that pattern in corporate adversaries. I'd seen it across deposition tables. I recognized it the way you recognize a legal argument you've defeated before. Not with alarm, but with a kind of professional familiarity. What I hadn't fully appreciated until that parking lot at the Lakeside Grand was that he'd made the classic error of the sophisticated operator. He'd misjudged his audience. Arturo was more straightforward in his ambitions, which in its way made him more honest. The $14.2 million development project he'd been so eager to describe at the rehearsal dinner was real. I'd verified that from public filings. And the state contractor's license he needed to proceed with it was not yet in hand. That license application, sitting in its final stage of technical review, represented something like 18 months of positioning for the Sanchez family. Pull it, and the project stalled. Delay it, and the financing window narrowed. The construction lending market wasn't forgiving about timing. I didn't feel triumphant thinking about this. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something more clinical, the particular focused calm of someone who has identified the precise point where pressure, legally applied, produces the correct result. Christine had asked whether I'd figured out where to sit, so I didn't inconvenience the photographer. As it turned out, I had a very clear sense of exactly where to position myself. The morning Paul called back, 3 days after the wedding. I was in the yard turning the last of the garden beds over for winter. The ground was cold and the work was honest, and I was thinking about nothing in particular when my phone rang. "You were right to wait," Paul said. "Here's what I found." He walked me through it methodically, the way a good attorney lays out a case. Cleanest facts first, complications after. The licensing application was real and advanced, with a technical committee recommendation expected within the month. The credit line at Carolina Realty Fund was active, with the current outstanding balance sitting at $1.35 million against the 3 properties. And the fund's operating agreement, which I'd signed and therefore read, cover to cover, twice, gave any board member with a direct or indirect interest in a borrower the explicit right to request a formal audit of that borrower's financial records. "You became an interested party the day Megan signed the marriage certificate," Paul said. "That's my right as well," I said. "Ray." His tone shifted slightly. Not concern exactly, but the careful note an attorney uses when he wants to make sure a client has considered all dimensions. "Once you move on either of these, they'll know it was you. Arturo will figure it out quickly. David will tell him." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at the bare garden beds. The stakes were still in the ground from the summer, thin wooden posts standing in rows, marking where things had been and where they'd grow again. "Paul," I said, "I spent 30 years being the person in the room that other people underestimated. I was always prepared for that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right, what do you want to do first?" "Nothing yet," I said. "I need 2 professionals, an auditor and an investigator. Neither of them should know the other exists, and neither of them should have any prior connection to me or to Ford and Whitfield. I can give you a name for the auditor." "Give me the name. I'll make the call myself." I finished the garden beds. Then I went inside and started the next list. Jennifer Reed's office was on the 14th floor of a building on East Trade Street, the kind of address that says competent without saying expensive, which in my experience is generally the more reliable indicator of the two. I'd found her name through Paul, verified her credentials independently through the North Carolina Association of CPAs, and read 3 years of her published audit summaries before I called. She came with no connection to Ford and Whitfield, no social overlap with anyone in my former professional circle, and a reputation for finding discrepancies that other auditors had missed or chosen not to look at too closely. I met her on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the wedding. "I'm Raymond Ford," I said. "I'm a member of the Investment Advisory Board at Carolina Realty Fund. One of our borrowers is Sanchez Property Group, LLC. 3 properties, a $1.35 million credit line, currently in the 3rd year of the agreement. Under the fund's operating agreement, board members with a direct interest in a borrower are entitled to request a formal audit of that borrower's financial records." Jennifer Reed was somewhere in her mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent years in rooms where people were trying not to tell her things. She let me finish. Then she said, "What's the nature of your interest in the borrower?" "My daughter married the principal operator of the LLC 2 weeks ago." She wrote something on a notepad. "And what specifically are you hoping the audit will examine?" "Rental income reporting versus actual deposits, operating expense categorization, any transfers between the LLC and related entities." I paused. "Standard scope. I'd like preliminary findings within 2 weeks if possible." "That's aggressive. 3 weeks, then." She looked at me over the top of the notepad. "What's the hourly rate you're expecting?" I named a number that was fair without being generous. She agreed to it without negotiating, which told me she'd already done the math and decided the engagement was worth her time. Good auditors, in my experience, always do the math before they agree to anything. I left her office and drove back to Mooresville. The investigator I found on my own. I didn't want a referral. Referrals create connections, and connections become complications. I wanted someone who operated in Charlotte, knew the local property market well enough to move around it without attracting notice, and had no existing relationship with anyone in my professional or personal orbit. I found Carlos Vargas through a professional directory, verified his licensing with the North Carolina Private Protective Services Board, and called him without introduction. His office was in a strip of small businesses on Wilkinson Boulevard. A plain door, a small sign, no attempt at atmosphere. The kind of place that suggests the work is the point. I told him what I needed: a review of any civil litigation history attached to David Sanchez, any out-of-state proceedings, any judgment liens or settlement agreements in the public record. I was specific about the scope and explicit about what I wasn't asking for. I didn't want surveillance. I didn't want anything that required his subjects' knowledge, and I didn't want anything that wouldn't hold up in a civil proceeding. Carlos Vargas listened with his hands flat on the desk and his expression professionally neutral. "Florida records?" he asked. "Anywhere," I said, "but Florida's worth a look." He quoted me a fee. I paid the retainer in cash and left. 11 days later, Jennifer Reed called. "Mr. Ford, the preliminary findings are ready." A pause, measured and deliberate. "You'll want to see these in person." I drove into Charlotte the following morning. She had a folder on the desk when I arrived. Not thick, but dense. The kind of document that carries weight in proportion to what's underlined rather than what's written. The core discrepancy was this. Over the 18 months covered by the audit period, Sanchez Property Group, LLC, had reported rental income of $612,000 across the 3 properties. The actual deposits into the LLC's operating accounts, as verified against bank records she'd obtained through the fund's formal audit rights, totaled $394,000. The gap, $218,000, wasn't explained by vacancy rates, which were low, or by documented maintenance expenses, which were modest. "There are also transfers out of the operating account," she said, "to a second LLC I couldn't fully trace within the scope of this engagement. The transfers total approximately $94,000 over the same period." I looked at the highlighted figures. $218,000 in unexplained variance, $94,000 in transfers to an entity I hadn't heard of before. "Is this fraud?" I asked. "It's a material discrepancy," she said carefully. "Whether it constitutes fraud is a legal determination, not an accounting one. What I can tell you is that it's sufficient grounds for a formal inquiry." "That's all I needed to know," I said. I thanked her, paid the balance of her fee, and left with a copy of the preliminary report in a plain manila envelope. Carlos Vargas called 2 days after that. His findings were shorter. In the late spring of 2022, a civil complaint had been filed in Miami-Dade County against David Sanchez personally. Breach of contract, arising from a property management dispute with a commercial tenant. The case had been resolved without trial, approximately 4 months later, with a settlement payment of $47,000. The settlement agreement was sealed under a non-disclosure provision. "How do you know the amount?" I asked. "Court costs and filing fees are public," he said. "The NDA covers the terms, not the existence of the resolution. The $47,000 figure is in the fee schedule attached to the dismissal." I wrote it down. Settlement, $47,000. NDA, Miami-Dade, 2022. I wasn't going to use it yet. I filed it the same way I'd filed everything else David had handed me without knowing he was handing me anything. Carefully, precisely, and out of sight. 3 days before I was ready to move, Megan called. She and David had been back from Asheville for nearly 2 weeks. The call came in the early evening, and her voice, when I answered, had a quality I recognized. The particular compression of someone choosing their words, precisely because they're not sure how much to say. "Dad." A breath. "David says I need to let him know in advance if I'm going to see my friends. Like, give him the schedule." I was quiet for a moment. "How far in advance?" 24 hours. Another breath. "He says it's about planning, about making sure we have time together." In 30 years of practice, I'd learned that the most important thing you can do in certain conversations is ask one specific question and then stop talking. "Are you saving the messages he sends you about this?" A pause, longer than I expected. "No." "Start saving them," I said. "All of them. Every platform." "Dad, I'm not asking you to do anything with them right now. Just save them." I kept my voice even. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Good." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The folder from Jennifer Reed was on the table in front of me. The notes from Carlos Vargas were in the small notebook from my glove compartment. Paul's summary of the fund's operating agreement was in a separate file on my laptop, with the relevant clause bookmarked. I had what I needed: more than what I needed. I thought about what Arturo had said at that rehearsal dinner, the $14.2 million project, the financing that basically handled itself. I thought about David standing 3 feet from his new wife and telling her father to remove himself from the picture. I thought about Megan's voice on the phone just now, and the particular way she'd said "I don't think" before she'd stopped. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up Paul's contact information, and typed a single line. "I'm ready. Let's talk tomorrow morning." I closed the laptop. I went to bed. The next move was mine. I want to go back to that evening. Not because it still hurts. It doesn't, not the way you might expect. But because I've thought about it enough times that I can describe it the way a surveyor describes land, with precision, without sentiment, noting every boundary and elevation. The last guests had gone. The band had loaded the van and pulled out of the lot. The Lakeside Grand was doing what venues do at the end of a long night, releasing its held breath, the staff moving quietly between tables, collecting glassware, folding linens. The chandeliers were still up but dimmed, the room halfway between celebration and cleanup. Megan was near the window, talking to the venue coordinator about something. A leftover centerpiece, I think, something she'd wanted to take home. David walked toward me from across the room. I saw him coming. He moved with the specific, unhurried quality of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say. He stopped about 18 inches from me, close enough to be deliberate, not close enough to be anything a witness might describe as confrontational. "Raymond," he said my name like it was a small object he was setting down. "Megan is my wife now. She belongs with me. Her life is with me." A brief pause, his eyes steady on mine. "And honestly, you can take yourself out of the picture. It'll be easier for everyone." I looked at him. What I noticed in that moment was not the words. The words were almost beside the point. Blunt and graceless, the kind of thing that gets said when someone has decided they've already won. What I noticed was Megan. She was 3 feet to his left. She had heard. I know my daughter's body language the way I know the Kataba's currents. I've been reading it since she was 4 years old, and what I saw in her shoulders, in the downward angle of her head, was not surprise. She wasn't surprised. That's where the problem actually lived. Not in David's confidence, not in the specific words he'd chosen, in the fact that Megan already knew he was capable of this and had already learned to go quiet when he was. I gave him 5 seconds of eye contact. Then I said, "Good night, David." I collected my jacket from the coat check. I walked to my truck. I sat in the parking lot with the engine off and watched the water for 10 minutes, the lights of the venue breaking on the surface in long gold lines. Then I thought about leverage. Not abstractly, concretely. I thought about the Carolina Realty Fund's operating agreement, which I had signed and therefore read, and the clause on page 31 that gave any board member with a direct or indirect interest in an active borrower the right to request a formal audit. I thought about Arturo Sanchez Development LLC's licensing application sitting in final technical review, and the name Paul had mentioned on the committee. A man I'd worked with in rooms exactly like the ones where I'd spent 30 years. I thought, the leverage is already there. I don't need to manufacture anything. I just need to confirm it exists before I move. I picked up the phone. I called Paul Bennett. Paul answered on the 3rd ring. He's been in corporate law long enough that a midnight call doesn't alarm him. It just tells him the situation is specific. I didn't explain the scene at the Lakeside Grand. I didn't describe what David had said or how Megan had looked at the floor. I asked one question. Was there an active application from Arturo Sanchez Development, LLC, at the North Carolina Contractor Licensing Board? Paul said he'd check. I said, "Please." I set the phone on the passenger seat. I started the truck. I drove home on 77 North with the windows cracked and the heat on low, the way I drive when I'm thinking rather than traveling. By the time I pulled into the driveway on Cedar Grove Lane, I had the architecture of it, not the details. Those would come later, from Paul, from the auditor I hadn't yet hired, from the public records I hadn't yet pulled. But the structure, 2 independent mechanisms, 2 different members of the Sanchez family, and enough legal standing on my part to operate through both of them, without once stepping outside what the documents already permitted me to do. I went inside. I didn't turn on the television. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, looking at nothing in particular. I wasn't angry. That might sound implausible, but it's accurate. What I felt was something closer to the focused quiet I used to feel at the beginning of a complicated case. When you know the problem is real, and you know your tools are adequate, and the only thing remaining is the work. David had told me to take myself out of the picture. I thought, I'm about to be the only thing in the frame. The next morning, Paul called before 7. He confirmed what I'd suspected. The application was real, advanced, and vulnerable. A single procedural intervention at the right moment could delay the technical committee's recommendation by weeks, possibly longer. He also confirmed the credit line structure, Sanchez Property Group LLC, and the specific clause in Carolina Realty Fund's operating agreement that made me, as of the day Megan signed the marriage certificate, a formally interested party with standing to request a borrower audit. I told him not to move anything yet. Then I drove out to the Catawba. I want to say something about fly fishing because people who don't do it sometimes think it's about patience in the passive sense. Waiting, doing nothing, hoping. It isn't. It's about reading moving water. It's about understanding where the fish are, why they're there, what they're eating, and how to present something to them that looks like what they're already looking for. It requires constant attention. It requires you to think about the system as a whole before you touch any individual part of it. I worked a stretch of riffles I know well, casting upstream and letting the line carry down, mending when the current pulled wrong. 2 hours, no fish, which didn't matter. By the time I waded back to the bank and stripped off my waders, I had decided 2 things. The first was that I would hire an auditor, someone with no connection to me or to Ford and Whitfield, to conduct a formal review of Sanchez Property Group LLC's financials under the fund's borrower audit provision. Whatever she found would be the foundation. The second was that I would hire a private investigator, separately, to review David's civil litigation history in any state that had public records. I wasn't moving yet. I was gathering. And somewhere across Charlotte, I was fairly certain, David Sanchez was waking up confident that the old man was out of the picture. I almost smiled. Almost. The morning it started, I was standing on the front porch of the house on Cedar Grove Lane with a mug of coffee, watching the light come through the oaks. It was cold enough that I could see my breath. I wasn't expecting company. The car that turned into my driveway was a black Audi, David's, one of those choices that says I've arrived in a language everyone is meant to understand. He parked at an angle that blocked the walkway, which may have been deliberate, or may have been the carelessness of someone who doesn't consider whether he's in anyone's way. With David, the distinction had always been difficult to establish. He got out without a jacket, no tie. His shirt was a dress shirt, the good kind, but untucked on the left side, which I'd never seen before. He looked like a man who had left the house before he was ready. His face was the color of January sky, that particular pale that isn't quite gray but is working toward it. There were shadows under his eyes that told me he'd been awake most of the night. He crossed the driveway quickly, not running, but moving with the compressed urgency of someone trying to appear calm while managing something that isn't calm at all. "Raymond!" His voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man holding 2 things at once, the face he wanted to present and the panic he was trying to keep behind it. "I need to talk to you." "Come in," I said. "Coffee's still hot." He stopped. For just a moment, the urgency in his face gave way to something else. A flicker of confusion, I think, because this wasn't the response he'd prepared for. He'd come ready for a confrontation. He'd come with a script. I'd offered him coffee. Inside, he stood at the kitchen table rather than sitting, which told me he hadn't fully decided yet whether to stay. I poured a second mug, set it on the table, and sat down in my usual chair. After a moment, he sat across from me. "I got a notice this morning," he said, "from the legal department at Carolina Realty Fund. They've frozen the credit line on Sanchez Property Group, the full $1.35 million, suspended pending an audit review." He put his hands flat on the table. His knuckles were white. "I need to know if you had anything to do with this." He was watching my face. I imagine he was hoping to see something. Surprise, guilt, discomfort. I've spent 30 years keeping my face neutral in rooms where people were watching it for exactly those things. It's a practiced skill, like casting. David, I said, what do you know about my professional background? He blinked. The question wasn't what he'd expected. Megan said you were a lawyer, retired. I was a senior partner at Ford and Whitfield LLP for just under 30 years. Corporate law. I retired 4 years ago. I picked up my mug. I've been on the investment advisory board of Carolina Realty Fund for 6 years. I'm still on it. He went very still. I reached across the table and placed a manila folder in front of him. He looked at it the way people look at things they already know they don't want to see. Then he opened it. Jennifer Reed's preliminary audit report. 18 months of financials. Rental income reported $612,000. Actual deposits verified $394,000. The gap, highlighted in yellow, $218,000. Below that, the notation about transfers to a second, untraced LLC, totaling approximately $94,000. I let him read. He got about halfway through the first page before he set it down. His jaw was tight. He looked at the wall to my left, then back at the table. Then, finally, at me. I don't know what you think you found, he said. The controlled voice was still there, but something had gone out of it. The architecture of it, like a building after the load-bearing wall shifts. I think I found a $218,000 discrepancy between reported and actual income, I said. I don't know what it means yet. That's what a formal audit is for. I set down my mug. You should know that the fund's operating agreement requires borrowers to cooperate fully with audit requests initiated by board members, with a direct interest. The process has already started. It runs on its own schedule now. He stared at the folder for a long moment. When he looked up, something had changed in his eyes. The particular shift that happens when a person has been operating under an assumption, and the assumption has just been removed, like a floor that was solid a moment ago. Who are you? He said. Not rhetorical, an actual question. I'm Megan's father, I said. I'm also not the person it would have been wise to hide documents from. The silence in the kitchen was thorough. The refrigerator ran. Outside, a car passed on Cedar Grove Lane. David's hands, still flat on the table, were trembling slightly. Not dramatically. Just the fine, constant tremor of controlled adrenaline with nowhere to go. His color had shifted again, this time towards something more interesting. Not the pale gray of when he'd arrived, but something mottled, the face of a man cycling through calculations and not liking the results. What do you want? He said finally. His voice had dropped. The architecture was gone entirely now. What was left was just sound. I stood. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The bed I'd turned over for winter. The bare stakes in neat rows marking where things had grown. I didn't answer right away. I believe in the weight of silence. In 30 years of practice, I learned that the person who fills silence first is usually the one who's afraid of it. David had spent the last 6 weeks assuming I was afraid of everything. Let him sit with the quiet for a moment. Let him revise his assumptions. Megan, I said. He said nothing. That's what I want, I said. I want my daughter treated like a person. I want her to be able to see her friends without filing a schedule. I want her to know where the joint documents are kept. I want her to stop practicing how to disappear in a room. I turned from the window and looked at him. That's the list. It's a short one. His face had gone through several things by then, and what had settled on it was something I recognized. Not remorse, exactly, but the recalculation of someone who has identified a threat he hadn't accounted for and is now working out the implications. He was smart enough to understand that the credit line freeze was not the end of this. He was smart enough to understand that a man who'd initiated a formal audit through an investment fund had other tools available and had probably already thought about which ones to use next. I'll think about it, he said. It was the wrong answer, but it was the honest one. He was still trying to negotiate. Take your time, I said. I picked up his untouched coffee mug and carried it to the sink. You know where to find me. He left. I watched the Audi back out of the driveway, still at the wrong angle, still blocking more space than necessary, and turn on to Cedar Grove Lane. I stood at the window for a while after he'd gone. The garden was still and bare in the morning light. The stakes stood in their rows, patient as arithmetic. David thought he'd come here to apply pressure. Instead, he'd walked into a deposition he hadn't prepared for, conducted in a kitchen by a man he'd written off as irrelevant. He'd looked at the folder. He'd seen the numbers. He'd asked who I was. He still didn't fully know, but he was beginning to understand the shape of the answer, and that for now was exactly where I wanted him. 3 days after David left my kitchen, Arturo Sanchez learned who I actually was. I know this because Paul called me that afternoon, and his voice carried the particular note of a man who has just watched the other side make a move and wants to make sure you've been informed. His attorney pulled your bar history, Paul said. Full record search. Ford and Whitfield. The years, the practice areas. They know. How long do you think that took them? I said. 20 minutes, probably. Maybe 30. It's public record. A pause. Ray, they're going to come back at you. A man like Arturo doesn't sit still when someone's hand is on his business. I know, I said. Let's see what he does first. What Arturo did was precise, and, I'll give him credit, reasonably sophisticated. He didn't call me. He didn't send his attorney to my door. He went sideways, the way experienced operators do when they can't move directly. He found a local business publication, the kind that covers Charlotte's commercial real estate scene, with the breathless enthusiasm of a trade journal that depends on the same developers it writes about for its advertising revenue. And he fed them a story. The story, which appeared online less than a week after David's visit, described an unnamed board member of a regional investment fund who was allegedly using his institutional position to block a credit facility for personal reasons. The piece didn't name me. It didn't name the fund. It referred carefully to a source with knowledge of the matter, and used phrases like potential conflict of interest and questions about governance standards. It was written vaguely enough to avoid a defamation claim, and specifically enough that anyone in Charlotte's commercial real estate community who wanted to read between the lines could. I read it twice over coffee. Then I set my phone down and thought about what it told me. It told me that Arturo was alarmed, genuinely alarmed, not just irritated, not just inconvenienced. A man who is confident in his position doesn't need to plant stories in trade publications. He escalates through proper channels. The fact that Arturo had gone to a journalist rather than a regulator told me he understood the audit process had more merit than he'd wanted to admit. He was trying to create reputational pressure because the legal pressure wasn't going anywhere he could control. It also told me something about his timeline. The licensing application was in final review. The committee recommendation was expected within a matter of weeks. He needed the credit line issue to go away quietly and quickly, and instead it had become a documented audit with its own procedural momentum. He was buying time the only way he had left, by making noise. I called Paul. Has the funds board seen the article? Yes. They're not pleased. They've asked their general counsel to look at it. Good. Make sure their general counsel understands that the audit request was initiated through proper channels under the operating agreement, that the discrepancies Jennifer Reed found are documented and material, and that the article appears to be a response to legitimate institutional oversight. I paused. Don't say anything else. Let the general counsel draw their own conclusions. They will, Paul said. They won't like being written about, even anonymously. No, I said. They won't. Then Megan called. Her voice, when she came through the line, had lost its careful compression. What was there instead was something raw. Not quite tears, but the vocal equivalent of standing in cold wind too long. David had told her, she said. He'd told her that I was attacking his family's livelihood, that I was trying to destroy his business because I didn't want her to have a life separate from me, that everything I'd done since the wedding had been about control and resentment, and the unwillingness to let her go. I let her finish. Then I asked, Did he show you where the joint property documents are kept? A long pause. No. I asked him. He said they're with his attorney. Whose attorney? Another pause. His, not ours. He said there was no reason for me to have copies. I kept my voice level. There is every legal reason for you to have copies, Megan. Those are your documents. Your name is on them. He's saying you're doing this because you don't trust him. I'm asking you where your legal documents are. That's a different question from whether I trust him. I waited a moment. He's trying to make you choose between me and the documents. Those aren't the same choice. She was quiet for several seconds. Dad, did you freeze his credit line? I initiated a formal audit of a borrower under the operating agreement of a fund I sit on. The audit found significant discrepancies. The credit line was suspended by the fund's legal department as a standard procedural response. That's not what I asked. I know, I said, but that's the accurate description of what happened. Another silence, longer. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied slightly. He says I can't see Claire this weekend. Claire is one of her closest friends, someone she'd known since college. He says it's because we need family time, but he didn't say that until after I asked. Are you saving the message where he said that? Yes, she said quietly. Good. I set the coffee down. Megan, I need you to ask him one more time where the property documents are. In writing, text or email. Ask him to send you copies. Why in writing? Because his answer either way is going to matter later. She didn't ask what I meant by later. I think, on some level, she already knew. By end of that same week, Paul called with the second piece of news. Arturo's attorney had filed an expedited processing petition with the North Carolina Contractor Licensing Board, requesting that the technical committee recommendation be accelerated to a specific date. Roughly 3 weeks out, the petition cited project financing constraints and time-sensitive construction windows. Both were true, and both were Code 4. Our credit situation is deteriorating, and we need this license before it gets worse. I wrote down the deadline on a notepad. 3 weeks. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went to make dinner, because I find that the most useful thing to do when someone else is moving on your timeline is to eat a proper meal and think clearly. They wanted to run the clock. I was about to stop it. I called Paul the next morning and told him what I needed. Through the fund, I said, a formal notice of interested party representation filed directly with the Contractor Licensing Board, citing the pending audit of Sanchez Property Group, LLC, as an affiliated entity of the applicant. Paul was quiet for a moment. That document notifies the board that there's an active financial review of an entity connected to the applicant, and asks the board to consider whether proceeding with approval would be appropriate while that review is unresolved. Correct. It doesn't require the board to deny anything. It just asks them to account for it, which is all it needs to do, I said. The board runs on procedure. Add procedure to the timeline, and the expedited petition loses its ground. The application gets stuck, Paul said. The application gets stuck, I confirmed. Paul filed the notice 2 days later. It was a single document, 4 pages, clean and specific, citing the fund's audit request, the preliminary findings, and the procedural question of whether approving a state contractor's license for an applicant whose affiliated entity was under active financial review met the board's standard for good standing. The board's general process required any such notice to be acknowledged and addressed before a final recommendation could be issued. The expedited petition became effectively irrelevant. I know this because Arturo's attorney called Paul within 6 hours of the filing. Paul relayed the conversation to me that evening. The tone, he said, had been controlled, but strained, the voice of a man who was calibrating how much alarm to display while displaying more than he intended. The attorney had questioned the standing of the notice. Paul had cited the relevant section of the board's procedural guidelines, which are public and which are quite clear on the point. The attorney had said he'd review the guidelines and be in touch. He had not yet been in touch. Meanwhile, Carlos Vargas came through with the second document. He delivered it in person, which I appreciated. He set a manila envelope on the table in my kitchen, the same table where David had sat 3 weeks earlier, staring at Jennifer Reed's audit report, and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a copy of a deed transfer dated from approximately 2 years prior. One of the 3 properties held by Sanchez Property Group, LLC, a commercial warehouse in the Belmont neighborhood, currently leased to a logistics company, had been transferred to an individual named Marcos Sanchez, listed at a residential address in Gastonia. David's cousin, Vargas said. I confirmed the family connection through public records and social media. The transfer was filed as a standard quitclaim deed. No notification to Carolina Realty Fund. I looked at the deed. The property was one of the three that collateralized the credit line. Transferring collateral without lender notification is a breach of virtually any standard commercial lending agreement. It's not subtle. It's the kind of thing that looks, in retrospect, like either an oversight or a deliberate attempt to move an asset before a problem arrives. Given what I already knew about David's operational style, I didn't think it was an oversight. "Thank you," I said to Vargas. I paid his final invoice in full that same afternoon. The document went to the fund's legal department the following morning, not through Paul, not through me personally. I sent it as a board member, attached to a brief memo, noting that a piece of collateral property associated with the suspended credit line appeared to have been transferred without lender notification, and that I wanted to bring it to the legal department's attention as a potentially material fact. I noted that I was not making a legal determination, that was their function, not mine, but that the transfer appeared inconsistent with the standard terms of the lending agreement. The fund's general counsel opened an internal proceeding that same day. I did not call David to tell him. I did not call Arturo. I set the memo aside, drove out to the Catawba for 2 hours, and came home in the late afternoon to find a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. It was Arturo Sanchez. His voice on the message was controlled in a way that takes effort, the kind of control that is itself a signal, because people who are genuinely calm don't need to work at it. He said he thought we should speak. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said that family was important to him and that he hoped we could find a resolution that worked for everyone involved. He left a callback number. I listened to the message twice. Then I deleted it. Not because I was being theatrical, because there was nothing in that message that required a response. Arturo hadn't offered anything. He'd expressed a preference for talking, which is what people do when they've run out of better options and haven't yet admitted it. The fund's proceeding would run at its own pace. The licensing board's standard process would reassert itself, now that the expedited petition had been neutralized. The audit findings were documented. The deed transfer was documented. None of that required my voice on a phone call with Arturo Sanchez. What it required was patience, which is a thing I have in reasonable supply. 3 days later, on a Thursday evening, I heard a car on the driveway. I looked out the window and saw a vehicle I didn't recognize. A rental by the plates, the kind of anonymous sedan that appears in driveways when someone needs to travel without being identified by their usual car. The door opened. Megan stepped out. She had a suitcase with her. She dragged it to the front porch without looking up. I opened the door before she had to knock. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. Her jaw was set in the particular way that means she's made a decision she'd rather not have needed to make. Her eyes were clear, not red, not swollen. She hadn't been crying. She'd been thinking. "He hid a second account from me," she said. "I found the statement. It's been open for 14 months. She didn't say anything else. She picked up the suitcase and carried it inside. Megan stayed in the spare bedroom, the room that used to have her drafting table in it before she moved out at 26, and I converted it to a guest room that nobody used. I put the drafting table back in storage when she left, but the light was still good in there, that particular afternoon angle from the south-facing window that she'd always liked for detail work. I didn't mention that. She had enough to carry without me adding the weight of what I'd kept. She'd been living at Cedar Grove Lane for 4 days when David's attorney made the first contact. The call came to Paul, not to me, which was the correct protocol, and told me that David had hired someone with adequate instincts, if not adequate information. The attorney introduced himself as representing David Sanchez in the matter of the suspended credit facility and certain related proceedings. He expressed an interest in exploring a negotiated resolution. Paul relayed this to me verbatim. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said I'd consult with my client and be in touch." And I'm consulting," Paul said. There was a dry quality to his voice that I recognized, the particular tone of a man who finds the situation satisfying, but is too professional to say so. "What do you want me to tell him?" "Tell him that my position on negotiation is straightforward. I'm not a party to any proceeding. The audit was initiated by the fund and is managed by the fund's legal department. The notice to the licensing board was filed on behalf of the fund. If David's attorney wants to discuss anything, he should be speaking with the fund's general counsel, not with me. That'll frustrate them. Yes, I said. It will. This was accurate in every legal sense. I had not sued David. I had not filed a complaint with any regulatory body. Every action I had taken was within my documented rights as a board member of an investment fund that happened to have lent money to my son-in-law's LLC. The fund's general counsel was running the proceedings now. I was a board member who had flagged a concern. The machinery was entirely institutional. David had assumed I was the pressure point. He kept looking at me when the pressure was actually coming from 6 different directions at once, all of them procedurally independent. The next 2 weeks moved with the compressed, institutional pace of processes that don't hurry for anyone. The fund's internal proceeding ran its course. Jennifer Reed submitted a final audit report, more thorough than the preliminary, with additional documentation of the transfers to the second LLC, which turned out to belong to a cousin-in-law of David's operating under a different name. The quitclaim deed transfer on the Belmont Warehouse property was confirmed as a breach of the collateral agreement. The fund's general counsel issued a formal finding. Sanchez Property Group, LLC, had violated the terms of the credit agreement in 2 documented respects: the undisclosed income variance and the unauthorized collateral transfer. The credit line, already suspended, was formally terminated. The LLC was required to repay the outstanding $1.35 million balance within 60 days, or the remaining collateral properties would be subject to foreclosure proceedings under the terms of the lending agreement. I read the fund's notice letter on a Tuesday morning over coffee. It was 11 pages, dense with citations and appendices. I read it the way I used to read opposing counsel's briefs, looking for gaps, finding none. It was a solid document. That same week, the North Carolina Contractor Licensing Board issued its response to the notice of interested party representation Paul had filed. The board's standard procedures required resolution of any documented financial compliance questions related to an applicant's affiliated entities before a final license recommendation could be issued. The expedited petition was formally set aside. The application for Arturo Sanchez Development, LLC, was placed in a status the board's correspondence described as pending resolution of outstanding interested party representation matter, which is the procedural equivalent of a drawer that closes and doesn't open again on anyone's preferred schedule. Arturo needed $890,000 to cover the repayment obligation and protect whatever remained of his son's business. He liquidated a portion of his personal investment holdings to do it. I know this because it became a matter of record when the fund acknowledged receipt of partial repayment. He was 64 years old, and he was pulling nearly $900,000 out of accounts he'd spent decades building to clean up a problem his son had created through carelessness and a certain comfortable assumption that consequences were things that happened to other people. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. What I felt was the quiet recognition of arithmetic working correctly. Then David filed for divorce. He filed it on a Wednesday through his attorney, citing irreconcilable differences. The filing came with a simultaneous motion to establish the date of separation and to identify marital assets, a procedural move that, in North Carolina family law, matters a great deal when one party suspects the other of having resources that aren't fully disclosed. He was, in other words, trying to get to the asset list before Megan did. He didn't know she'd already retained an attorney. She'd called me 2 evenings earlier, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and asked me if I knew a good family law attorney. She said it quietly, in the way she says things she's thought about for a long time before saying them. I gave her 3 names, attorneys I knew by professional reputation, none of them from Ford and Whitfield. None of them owed me anything. I told her to call all 3 and choose the one she felt most comfortable with. She chose a woman named Patricia Torres, whose practice was on Providence Road and whose reputation in the Charlotte family bar was, by every account I'd been able to verify informally, excellent. When David's filing landed, Patricia Torres was already working. Megan's legal position was documented. The saved messages about scheduling her social engagements, the text exchange where she'd asked David for copies of the joint property documents, and received a response that managed to say nothing in 47 words. The bank statement from the hidden account she'd found in the mail. 14 months of transactions in an account that held, at its peak, approximately $138,000 that had never been disclosed in any financial conversation between them. Patricia filed a response to the divorce petition that included, among other things, a formal discovery request for complete financial disclosure, and a motion noting that the hidden account represented a breach of marital financial transparency under North Carolina law, which the court would be asked to consider in any equitable distribution determination. David's attorney went quiet for 9 days. I sat on my porch in the evenings that week and watched the winter sky go from pale to dark. The garden was still bare. Megan came out once and sat in the other chair without saying much, and we watched the oaks together for a while in the way that two people who have known each other a long time can sit without needing to fill the space. "I made a mistake," she said at one point. "Not about anything specific, just that." "You trusted someone who wasn't trustworthy," I said. "That's not the same thing." She didn't answer. After a while, she went inside. I stayed on the porch until the cold made it impractical. Then I thought, the documents have done what documents do. The rest is just waiting for the calendar to catch up. The court's equitable distribution order arrived on a morning in early March, when the light had just started to shift toward something that felt, tentatively, like the approach of spring. Paul had forwarded it electronically, but I printed it out, an old habit. The preference for paper that 30 years of practice instills in ways you don't fully notice until you're holding a document and realizing that's how you read anything that matters. Megan was at the kitchen table when I came in with the pages. She looked up. I set the order in front of her without saying anything, and she read it the way she reads architectural drawings, methodically from the beginning, not skipping to the conclusion. The court had applied North Carolina's equitable distribution statute, which requires a fair division of marital assets while accounting for documented misconduct related to those assets. The hidden account, the quitclaim deed transfer, and the pattern of financial concealment established through discovery had all been entered into the record. The division came out at 60% to Megan, 40% to David, across the net marital estate. Additionally, the court ordered a compensatory distribution of $74,500, representing the court's assessment of the financial harm caused by the concealed account. Megan read to the end. Then she set the papers down and looked at the table for a moment. Her jaw did the thing it does when she's processing something large. A slight, almost imperceptible tightening, then release. 74,000, she said. 500, I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. She picked up her tea. I poured my coffee. We sat at the table and didn't say anything for a while, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the pages in the particular way that winter light does, when it finally starts to mean something again. What happened to the Sanchez family after that took place on its own schedule, without my involvement. Sanchez Property Group, LLC, completed the repayment of the credit line using the funds Arturo had liquidated, which meant the collateral properties weren't foreclosed, but the LLC itself, stripped of its credit facility and operating with accounts that were now subject to ongoing audit requirements from the fund, had no practical mechanism to continue. The dissolution filing appeared in the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds several weeks after the divorce order. 3 properties, 3 separate dispositions. 1 sold, 2 transferred to cover remaining debts. Arturo Sanchez Development, LLC's license application remained in the board's pending status. Without a clean financial record for the affiliated entity, and without the resolved proceedings that the board's notice requirement demanded, the application didn't move. A short item appeared in the same business publication that had run the anonymous article about personal interference at a regional fund. This one factual, brief, noting that the developer had announced an indefinite delay of the Concord project due to changed market conditions. The irony of the same publication carrying both items was not lost on me. I read it twice, as I had read the first one, and then I set my phone down and went to check the seed packets I'd ordered in January. David Sanchez left Charlotte. I know this because Megan mentioned, without particular emphasis, that he'd taken a position with a property management firm in Raleigh. She said it the way you say something that has stopped being important. I didn't ask for details. They weren't relevant to anything that needed to happen next. Christine Sanchez I never heard from again. I imagine she found a way to narrate the events that preserved the version of herself she needed to preserve. People like Christine always do. She'd look at what happened and see an unfortunate business matter, a family difficulty, an obstacle that had arisen and been managed. She would not, I suspect, revisit the moment at the rehearsal dinner when she'd asked my daughter, in a voice designed to carry whether her father had figured out where to sit, so he didn't inconvenience the photographer. Some people don't learn. Some things don't require them to. Megan started back at her architecture practice about 3 weeks after the order came through. She'd been away from active projects for nearly 2 years. David had discouraged the late hours, the client calls on weekends, the way the work had its own rhythms that didn't always match his preferred schedule. She went back to it the way you go back to something you know how to do. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the practical orientation of someone who remembers where the tools are. She took on a residential renovation project in Noda, a 1940s bungalow, structural work, the kind of project where the problems reveal themselves incrementally and required judgment as much as calculation. She talked about it at dinner one evening with the specific, technical enthusiasm she gets when something is actually interesting to her, and I listened and asked questions about load-bearing walls and permit timelines, because those were the right questions. At some point I got up from the table and went to the window. The garden was still cold, but the soil had changed. The particular shift that happens in early March, when the ground stops being winter and starts being something else. Not warm, just different, ready. "I'm going to start the tomatoes soon," I said. "Indoors first, then transplant when the frost has passed." Megan looked at me from the table. "You do this every year. The heirlooms take longer. You have to start them earlier than people think." She considered this. "Is there a lesson in there somewhere?" "There's a tomato in there somewhere," I said. "The lesson is optional." She laughed. "The real one." I'd been listening for it. I want to say one last thing, because I've been telling this story from the beginning, and I think it deserves an honest conclusion. I made one phone call the night of the wedding. I used legal tools I was already entitled to use. I hired professionals whose fees I paid in full. I filed documents through proper channels and let institutional processes run their course. I never threatened anyone. I never raised my voice to David Sanchez, not once, not in any of the rooms where we found ourselves across a table from each other. He'd told me to take myself out of the picture he was imagining, the one where he controlled Megan's schedule and her documents, and her access to her own financial life, the one where her father was a retired fisherman with no particular relevance to anything. That picture doesn't exist anymore. I made one call, the documents did the rest, and on a cold March morning, sitting on the porch of the house on Cedar Grove Lane, with the last of the winter light coming through the oaks, and a cup of coffee that was finally the right temperature, I thought, I was never out of the picture. He just couldn't see me in it. That's the thing about being underestimated by people who've made up their minds. The estimation is their problem. The response is yours. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.